My name is Rachel Thornfield. I'm 38 years old, a small-town librarian who drives a 15-year-old Honda Civic and clips coupons to afford groceries. But 3 hours ago, I discovered I'm worth $89 million. 3 hours ago, everything I thought I knew about my family, about my place in this world, crumbled like old newspapers in the rain. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. I'm standing outside Willowbrook Methodist Church in the bitter February cold, watching through frost-covered windows as my family celebrates the life of the man who raised me. My grandfather, Edmund Thornfield, the man they wouldn't let me say goodbye to. The iron gates of the churchyard are locked against me. My own blood, my own family, posted security to keep me out. They hired actual security guards. 2 men in black suits, who look like they'd rather be anywhere else, avoiding eye contact as they stand between me and the only person who ever truly loved me. Inside, I can see them through the stained glass. My mother, Victoria Thornfield Walsh, draped in designer black, dabbing her eyes with a silk handkerchief that probably cost more than my monthly rent. My stepfather, Richard Walsh, the real estate mogul who swept my mother off her feet when I was 12, stands beside her in a suit that screams money. My half-brother Marcus, golden boy extraordinaire, shakes hands and accepts condolences like he's running for office. They're all there. Cousins I haven't spoken to in years. Family friends who used to ruffle my hair at Christmas gatherings. Business associates from Grandpa's construction empire. Everyone except me. I press my fingers against the cold stone wall, feeling the rough texture bite into my skin. The last time I saw most of these people was at my college graduation 8 years ago. I remember scanning the crowd for familiar faces, hoping to see someone, anyone from my family cheering for me. Instead, I found them clustered in the back corner, checking their phones, whispering among themselves, looking like they'd rather be getting root canals. That was the last family event I was invited to, until today, when I showed up uninvited to bury the only person who ever believed in me. The security guard on the left shifts uncomfortably. He's maybe 25, probably working his way through college. His partner looks older, more weathered, the kind of man who's seen enough family drama to fill a library. They both know this isn't right. I can see it in the way they avoid looking directly at me, the way their shoulders tense every time someone inside laughs a little too loudly. "Ma'am," the younger guard says softly, "maybe you should." "I'm not leaving," I cut him off, my voice steadier than I feel. "That's my grandfather in there." He nods, looks down at his shoes. Even strangers can see the injustice of this moment. Through the window, I watch my mother rise to speak. Victoria Thornfield Walsh, the woman who named me after her favorite aunt but couldn't be bothered to remember my birthday half the time. She's always been beautiful in that polished, untouchable way that makes people assume she's also kind. But I know better. I've seen the way her smile turns razor-sharp when she thinks no one's watching. She's talking about Grandpa's legacy now, about his devotion to family, his generous spirit. The irony would be funny if it weren't so devastating. This is the same woman who, 3 months ago, hung up on me when I called to tell her about Grandpa's latest hospital stay. "He's fine, Rachel," she'd said in that clipped tone she reserves for inconvenient conversations. "Stop being so dramatic. Some of us have real responsibilities." Real responsibilities. As if caring about a dying old man was some kind of hobby, some frivolous waste of time. But they're all here now, aren't they? Now that he's gone, now that there's a will to be read and assets to be divided, suddenly, everyone cares about Edmund Thornfield's legacy. I pull my worn coat tighter around my shoulders. It's the same black wool coat I've worn to every funeral, every interview, every occasion that required something more formal than my usual cardigan and slacks. It's starting to pill at the elbows, and there's a small stain near the hem that never quite came out, but it's warm, and it's mine, and it's all I have. Inside, Marcus has taken the podium. My half-brother, the crown prince of the Walsh real estate dynasty, the one who got everything I never did. He's talking about Grandpa's work ethic, about how he built Thornfield Construction from nothing into one of the most successful companies in the state. He's using words like inspiration, and patriarch, and beloved, and every syllable feels like a knife twist. Beloved. Yes, Grandpa was beloved. Just not by the people speaking about him right now. I think about the last time I saw him alive, 2 weeks ago, in the sterile quiet of Riverside General Hospital. He was so small in that bed, so fragile, but his eyes were still sharp, still the same ice blue that could see right through any pretense. They don't visit, he'd whispered, his voice paper thin but determined. None of them. 43 years I've been in this family, Rachel, and when it matters, when I'm dying, you're the only one who shows up. I held his hand, feeling how cold it was despite the heated room. You don't have to worry about them, Grandpa, I'm here. I know you are, sweetheart. You always have been. Those were almost the last words he said to me. The next day, he slipped into unconsciousness. 3 days later, he was gone. And somehow, in those 3 days, my family managed to plan an entire funeral without telling me when or where it would be held. I found out from his neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, who stopped by the library where I work. She'd seen the obituary in the paper and wanted to express her condolences. That's how I learned my own grandfather was dead. From a neighbor who thought I already knew. The obituary didn't mention me at all. Survived by his daughter Victoria Thornfield Walsh, her husband Richard Walsh, and their son, Marcus Walsh. As if his granddaughter, the one who spent every summer with him, the one who called him every Sunday for 20 years, simply didn't exist. But I existed enough for them to hire security to keep me out. A black Mercedes pulls up to the curb and I recognize the man who steps out. James Morrison, Grandpa's lawyer for the past 30 years. He's carrying a leather briefcase. Moving with the careful precision of someone who's delivered both good news and devastating blows with equal professionalism. He stops when he sees me, his expression unreadable behind wire-rimmed glasses. We've met before, years ago, when Grandpa updated his will the first time. I remember sitting in Morrison's mahogany-paneled office, wondering why I was there, why Grandpa had insisted I come along for what seemed like routine legal business. Miss Thornfield, Morrison says now, his voice carrying just enough warmth to cut through the February chill. I wasn't sure you'd be here. They didn't tell me about the funeral, I say simply. I had to find out from a neighbor. Something shifts in his expression. Not a surprise, exactly, but a kind of weary recognition. As if he'd expected this exact conversation, this exact moment. I see, he says carefully. That's unfortunate. Inside, the service is winding down. I can see people beginning to shift in their seats. The restless energy that signals the end of formal proceedings. Soon they'll file out, they'll drive to the cemetery for the burial I also won't be allowed to attend. And then they'll gather at my mother's house for the reception where they'll drink expensive wine and share carefully curated memories of a man they barely knew. Morrison checks his watch. The reading is scheduled for this afternoon, 2 o'clock at my office. I wasn't informed about that either. He nods slowly, as if confirming something he already suspected. Well, you're informed now. I suggest you be there, Miss Thornfield. I think you'll find it enlightening. There's something in his tone that makes me look at him more carefully. Morrison has been practicing law for 40 years. He's seen every kind of family drama, every variety of greed and betrayal that money can inspire. But right now, standing in the cold outside a church where a granddaughter has been barred from her grandfather's funeral, he looks almost anticipatory. Mr. Morrison, I start to ask, but he's already walking toward the church entrance, briefcase in hand, moving with purpose. The security guards step aside to let him pass. Of course they do. He's expected. He belongs. I wrap my arms around myself and lean back against the stone wall. In a few hours, I'll drive across town to Morrison's office and sit in a room full of people who have spent the last 26 years making sure I knew exactly how little I mattered to them. They'll listen to the reading of my grandfather's will. They'll divide up his possessions like vultures picking at a carcass. And I'll watch from the sidelines once again. But something about Morrison's tone, about the way he looked at me just now, suggests that maybe, just maybe, this afternoon won't go the way my family expects. The church doors open, and people begin to stream out. My mother appears first, still beautiful, still perfectly composed, accepting hugs and handshakes with practiced grace. Marcus follows, looking every inch the grieving grandson in his expensive suit and designer tie. Richard brings up the rear, already checking his phone, probably scheduling his next appointment. They don't look in my direction. Why would they? As far as they're concerned, I'm not here. I never was. I was 7 years old when my father died, and that's when the fault lines in my family first began to crack open. Before the accident, we lived in a modest 2-bedroom house on Maple Street, where my mother actually smiled sometimes and my father would read me bedtime stories about brave princesses who saved themselves. Thomas Thornfield was Edmund's only son, a gentleman who taught high school history and coached the debate team on weekends. He drove a used Toyota, wore the same 3 ties in rotation, and believed that education could change the world. My mother used to roll her eyes at his idealism, but back then it was affectionate exasperation, not the bitter resentment that would come later. The night he died, I was sleeping over at Grandpa Edmund's house. It was one of our regular Friday night adventures. Pizza from Tony's, old Western movies, and stories about the early days of Thornfield construction when Grandpa built houses with his own 2 hands. I fell asleep on his living room couch, wrapped in one of Grandma Ruth's quilts, while John Wayne rode across the television screen. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now back to where we left off. The phone rang at 2 in the morning. I woke to find Grandpa standing in the kitchen doorway, his face gray in the dim light, the receiver trembling in his hand. "There's been an accident," he whispered, though I don't think he meant for me to hear. My father's car had skidded on black ice, rolled 3 times, and wrapped around an oak tree on Highway 9. He died instantly, they told us later, as if that was supposed to be comforting. As if the speed of it somehow made it hurt less. I stayed with Grandpa for 2 weeks while my mother handled arrangements. I was too young to understand what that meant, but I learned later she was meeting with lawyers, insurance adjusters, and eventually, a real estate developer named Richard Walsh, who made an offer on our house before my father was even buried. When she finally came to get me, she looked different. Sharper somehow, like someone had sanded away all the soft edges. Her hair was styled in a way I'd never seen before, and she wore a black dress that fit her like it had been made specifically for her body. She moved differently too, with a kind of calculated precision that made me think of the actresses in the old movies Grandpa loved. "Pack your things, Rachel," she said, not bothering with hello or asking how I was doing. "We're moving." Moving meant leaving everything I'd ever known. My room with its glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling. The tire swings in our backyard. The school where Miss Henderson had just started teaching me cursive writing. Moving meant leaving the house where my father's presence still lingered in every corner, where his coffee mug still sat unwashed in the kitchen sink. But most devastatingly, moving meant leaving Grandpa Edmund. Our new house was in Riverside Heights, the most expensive neighborhood in town. It was 3 times the size of our old place, with marble countertops and a circular driveway and rooms we never used. Richard Walsh had bought it as a wedding present for my mother, along with a new wardrobe, a new car, and apparently a new identity as the kind of woman who belonged in such places. The wedding happened 6 months after my father's death. I wasn't asked to be at the wedding party. Instead, I sat in the 3rd row next to Great Aunt Helen, wearing a dress my mother had picked out without consulting me, watching her marry a man I'd met exactly twice. Richard Walsh was everything my father hadn't been. Tall where Dad was average height, loud where Dad was thoughtful, rich where Dad had been comfortable but careful with money. He owned Walsh Development, one of the largest real estate companies in the state, and he treated every conversation like a business negotiation he was determined to win. During the reception, while my mother danced with her new husband and accepted congratulations from people I'd never seen before, I sat at a table in the back and picked at a wedding cake that tasted like sweet cardboard. Grandpa Edmund found me there, looking uncomfortable in a suit that was too formal for his taste. "How are you holding up, kiddo?" he asked, sitting down beside me. I shrugged, not trusting my voice. At 7, I didn't have the words to explain that I felt like I was disappearing, like everyone was moving on from my father's death except me, like I was becoming invisible in my own life. Grandpa seemed to understand anyway. "Your dad was proud of you, you know. So proud. He used to call me every Sunday just to tell me about something smart you'd said or some book you'd read." That's when I started crying. Not the polite, quiet tears my mother preferred, but the kind of sobbing that comes from somewhere deep and desperate. Grandpa didn't tell me to stop or worry about my appearance. He just held me until the storm passed, and then he said something I would carry with me for the next 30 years. Just because things change doesn't mean love disappears. Your father's love is still here, Rachel. It's in you. And no matter what happens, no matter how different things get, you'll always have that. 2 years later, when I was 9, Marcus was born. If my father's death had cracked my family apart, Marcus's arrival shattered whatever remained of my place in it. From the moment he drew breath, he became the center of my mother's universe in a way I had never been, not even before Dad died. She would spend hours just staring at him, touching his tiny fingers, whispering to him in a soft voice I barely remembered her using with me. Richard was no better, parading around like he'd personally invented fatherhood, taking pictures of Marcus doing completely ordinary baby things, as if each yawn was a miraculous achievement. "He has your eyes, Victoria," Richard would say at least 3 times a day, as if this was both surprising and wonderful. "And your strong jaw," she'd reply, tracing Marcus's face with one finger. "He's going to be handsome, just like his daddy." I would watch these exchanges from the doorway, feeling like a ghost haunting a house where I no longer belonged. When people came to visit the new baby, they'd coo over Marcus and congratulate my parents, and sometimes, if I was lucky, someone would notice me standing there and ask how I liked being a big sister. "She's adjusting wonderfully," my mother would answer before I could speak. "Such a helpful girl." Helpful. That became my role in the Walsh family. I was helpful Rachel, responsible Rachel, the girl who could be counted on to fetch diapers and warm bottles and entertain herself quietly while the real family bonded over the miracle of Marcus. When Marcus was old enough to walk, I became his unpaid babysitter. When he started talking, I was expected to help him with his words. When he began school, I was responsible for making sure he got on the bus and had his lunch and didn't forget his backpack. But I was never his sister, not really. Sisters fight and laugh and share secrets. We were more like strangers sharing a house, with me always in the background, always helpful, always forgotten. The weekends I spent with Grandpa Edmund became my lifeline. Every other Saturday, he would pick me up in his old Ford pickup, and we'd drive to his house on the other side of town where time moved differently, where I could be loud if I wanted to, or quiet, or sad, or angry, where someone actually listened when I talked and remembered what I had said from week to week. Grandpa's house was nothing like the Walsh mansion. It was small and comfortable, filled with furniture that had stories and photographs that captured real moments instead of posed perfection. The kitchen always smelled like coffee and whatever project he was working on in his workshop out back. The living room had bookshelves built into every available wall, stuffed with everything from Louis L'Amour westerns to thick biographies of historical figures I'd never heard of. "A house should feel like a hug," he told me once, and that's exactly what his place was. A hug made of wood and worn carpet and memories. He taught me how to use power tools safely, how to read blueprints, and how to tell the difference between load-bearing walls and decorative ones. By the time I was 12, I could frame a doorway and install drywall and tile a bathroom floor. These weren't skills my mother thought I needed, but Grandpa insisted they were important. "Everyone should know how to build something," he'd say, handing me a level or a measuring tape. "There's satisfaction in creating something with your own hands, something that wasn't there before you started working." While Marcus was taking tennis lessons and piano lessons and French tutoring, I was learning the weight of a hammer and the satisfaction of driving a nail perfectly straight. While he was attending cotillion and etiquette classes, I was learning to read the grain of wood and the way morning light moved across a room. At home, these skills were either ignored or actively discouraged. When I fixed a squeaky door in my room, my mother scolded me for playing with tools and hired someone to check my work. When I built a bookshelf for my bedroom, she called it inappropriate and had Richard move it to the garage where no one would see it. But at Grandpa's house, every project was celebrated, every new skill was praised, every question was answered with patience and respect. "You've got good hands, Rachel," he'd tell me, watching as I measured twice and cut once the way he'd taught me. "Steady hands and a sharp mind. That's a powerful combination." Those weekends sustained me through years of feeling invisible in my own home. They gave me something that belonged entirely to me, something my mother couldn't critique or Richard couldn't dismiss, or Marcus couldn't accidentally overshadow just by existing. They gave me a grandfather who saw me, really saw me, and thought I was worth teaching, worth knowing, worth loving, exactly as I was. High school was when the divide between my two worlds became impossible to ignore. At Riverside Preparatory Academy, where Richard's money had secured my enrollment, I was surrounded by classmates who drove BMWs to school and planned spring break trips to Europe like other kids planned sleepovers. Their biggest concerns were which Ivy League school would accept them, and whether their parents would buy them apartments in Manhattan or just pay for the penthouse dorms. I drove Grandpa's old pickup truck when he let me borrow it, and my biggest concern was whether I could afford both gas and lunch money for the week. The truck became a source of constant embarrassment for my mother. "Rachel, really?" she'd say, watching me pull into the circular driveway of our mansion. "What will the neighbors think? Richard bought you a perfectly good Honda Accord." But the Honda felt like a cage, all gleaming paint and new car smell and expectations I couldn't meet. The truck felt like freedom. It smelled like sawdust and coffee and the peppermint gum Grandpa always chewed while he worked. When I sat behind that wheel, I could pretend I was driving towards something instead of away from everything I'd lost. My grades were excellent, but nobody seemed to notice. When I brought home report cards filled with A's, my mother would glance at them briefly and say, "That's nice, dear," before returning to whatever Marcus was doing. Marcus, meanwhile, was celebrated for C's and B's as if he'd cured cancer. Every mediocre test score was displayed on the refrigerator. Every minor achievement was announced at dinner like breaking news. "Marcus got an A- on his history presentation," Richard would announce, beaming with pride. "Tell Rachel about the Revolutionary War project, son." And Marcus would launch into a description of some poster board and printed out Wikipedia articles, while I sat there thinking about the 20-page research paper I'd written on women's suffrage that had earned me the highest grade in my advanced placement history class. A paper nobody had asked to see. The worst part wasn't being ignored. The worst part was how systematically I was excluded from family decisions, family traditions, family identity. When Richard's company was featured in Business Weekly magazine, the accompanying photo showed him standing in front of one of his luxury developments with Victoria and Marcus at his side, all three of them smiling like a catalog family. I wasn't in the picture. I wasn't even mentioned in the article's description of his close-knit family. When they took vacations, I was sent to stay with Grandpa Edmund, which was actually the highlight of my year. But the message was clear. Rachel wasn't part of the family unit that mattered. College applications became another battlefield. I wanted to study library science at the State University, a practical degree that would let me work with books and help people find information. It wasn't glamorous, but it felt right to me. Libraries had always been my sanctuary, quiet places where knowledge was free and anyone could belong. "Library science?" my mother said when I showed her my application essays. "Rachel, that's not a career. That's a hobby. Richard, talk to her." Richard looked up from his newspaper with the expression of someone being asked to explain quantum physics to a toddler. "What about business? Pre-law? Something with earning potential?" "I want to help people," I said quietly. "You can help people by being successful first," Richard replied. "Look at Marcus. He's already thinking about following in my footsteps, maybe taking over the company someday." Marcus was 12 years old and still needed help tying his shoes, but apparently he was already being groomed for corporate leadership, while my actual achievements were treated like quaint hobbies. I applied to the library science program anyway, using money I'd saved from the small allowance Grandpa gave me for helping with his business paperwork. When the acceptance letter arrived, I kept it hidden in my room for 2 weeks before finally showing it to my family at dinner. "State University?" My mother's voice could have frozen water. "Rachel, we had an understanding. You were going to apply to real schools." "It is a real school, and they offered me a partial scholarship." "We don't need scholarships," Richard said firmly. "I can afford to send you anywhere, but not for library science. Choose something worthwhile and we'll talk." That night I called Grandpa Edmund from the landline in the kitchen, keeping my voice low so no one would overhear. "I'm proud of you, kiddo," he said when I told him about the acceptance. "Your grandmother Ruth would have been proud too. She always said libraries were temples, places where anyone could worship at the altar of knowledge." "They don't want me to go?" "What do you want?" It was such a simple question, but nobody had asked me that in years. What did I want? I wanted to matter. I wanted to be seen. I wanted to build something meaningful with my life, even if it wasn't the kind of success that impressed people at country club dinners. I want to go, I said finally. Then go. Grandpa offered to pay my tuition, but I couldn't accept. It felt too much like charity, too much like admitting my own family wouldn't support me. Instead, I took out student loans, worked part-time jobs, and made it through 4 years of college with a combination of stubbornness and scholarship money. My graduation ceremony was a small affair. State University wasn't fancy like the private colleges my high school classmates attended. There were no celebrity speakers or historic buildings draped in ivy. Just a practical campus filled with students who worked hard because they had to, not because it looked good on applications. I searched the audience for familiar faces as we walked across the stage in our caps and gowns. Grandpa Edmund was there in the third row, wearing the same suit he'd worn to my mother's wedding, his weathered hands clapping enthusiastically as they called my name. Behind him sat Mrs. Patterson, his neighbor, who had become like a grandmother to me over the years. My mother, Richard, and Marcus were nowhere to be seen. Later, Grandpa took me to dinner at Romano's, a little Italian place downtown that had red checkered tablecloths and waitresses who remembered your name. We sat in a corner booth, my diploma propped against the salt shaker, sharing pizza and talking about everything except the empty chairs where my family should have been. "You did this yourself," Grandpa said, raising his glass of root beer in a toast. "Nobody can ever take that away from you." I got my first job at Millfield Public Library 3 months later. It was a small-town position with a small-town salary, but I loved everything about it. The smell of old books and fresh coffee, the quiet rustle of pages turning, the satisfaction of helping someone find exactly what they were looking for, whether it was information about Social Security benefits or the latest romance novel. I rented a tiny apartment above Murphy's hardware store, furnished it with pieces from thrift shops and garage sales, and for the first time in my adult life, I felt like I was home. My space, my choices, my life. But the distance from my family only grew wider. When I sent them my new address, I got a polite note back from my mother, saying how quaint my career choice was, and how they hoped I'd figure things out eventually. When I called to invite them for Thanksgiving dinner at my new place, Victoria explained that they had established traditions and couldn't possibly break them for my little apartment. The established tradition I learned from Grandpa Edmund was a catered dinner at the country club, followed by cocktails with the Walsh business associates. No family conversation, no shared memories, just networking disguised as gratitude. I spent that Thanksgiving with Grandpa instead, cooking a turkey in his ancient oven and watching football on his fuzzy television while we argued about whether stuffing should have celery in it. It was the best Thanksgiving I'd had in years. Christmas was worse. I bought thoughtful gifts for everyone. A first-edition mystery novel for my mother, who used to love reading before she got too busy being important. A vintage compass for Richard, who collected antique navigation instruments. A set of building blocks for Marcus that would let him create architectural designs. I wrapped them carefully and drove to the Walsh mansion on Christmas Eve, the same way I'd done for the past 15 years. The house was full of light and laughter and people I didn't recognize. Catering staff moved through the rooms carrying silver trays. A string quartet played classical music in the living room. Everyone was dressed like they were attending a gallery opening rather than a family celebration. My gifts were accepted with polite smiles and set aside unopened. An hour later, I found them stacked on a table in Richard's study, already forgotten among the expensive presents from business partners and social acquaintances. But Marcus's gifts, a new bike, a computer, clothes, games, gadgets, were opened with great ceremony and photographed from multiple angles for social media. Every present came with a story about how much thought had gone into choosing it, how specially ordered it had been, how it represented their love for their brilliant, wonderful son. I left early that night claiming I had to work the next morning. Nobody seemed to notice my departure. The pattern continued for years. Birthdays acknowledged with generic cards signed by my mother's secretary. Holidays spent feeling like an unwelcome guest in rooms where I'd once lived. Achievements celebrated privately with Grandpa Edmund while my real family continued building their lives around the idea that I simply didn't matter. But I kept trying. I kept calling, kept sending cards, kept showing up to events where I felt like a stranger. Because somewhere deep down, I still hoped that someday they would see me, really see me, and remember that I was part of their story too. I had no idea that while I was fighting for scraps of attention from people who had never really loved me, the one person who did love me was quietly planning to change everything. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning in October, just as I was opening the library for the day. I was balancing my coffee, my keys, and a stack of returned books when my cell phone rang with an unfamiliar number. "Is this Rachel Thornfield?" The voice was crisp, professional, tinged with an accent I couldn't place. "Yes, speaking." "This is Dr. Patricia Chen from Riverside General Hospital. I'm calling about your grandfather, Edmund Thornfield. He's listed you as his emergency contact." The stack of books tumbled from my arms, scattering across the library's marble floor with a sound like thunder. Emergency contact. I hadn't known that. In all our Sunday phone calls, all our weekend visits, Grandpa had never mentioned updating his medical information to include me. "What happened? Is he okay?" "He's stable now, but he was brought in early this morning after suffering a heart attack. He's asking for you." I closed the library, something I'd never done in 6 years of working there, and drove to the hospital with my hands shaking on the steering wheel. Riverside General was the same place where my father had been pronounced dead 31 years ago, and walking through those automatic doors felt like stepping back into the worst day of my childhood. Grandpa Edmund looked impossibly small in the hospital bed, dwarfed by machines that beeped and hummed around him. His skin was gray against the white sheets, and there were tubes and wires connecting him to devices I didn't understand. But his eyes were alert, and when he saw me, he managed a weak smile. "There's my girl," he whispered, his voice rougher than I'd ever heard it. "Don't talk," I said, taking his hand. "Just rest. The doctor said you're going to be fine." "Rachel." His grip tightened slightly. "I need to tell you something. About the business. About what I've built." "Grandpa, please. We can talk about business later." "No." There was urgency in his voice, the kind of determination I remembered from when he taught me to use power tools. "Listen to me. Thornfield Construction isn't just what people think it is." Over the next hour, as nurses came and went and monitors tracked his vital signs, Grandpa Edmund told me things I'd never known about the company he'd built from nothing. Thornfield Construction wasn't just a regional building firm anymore. Over the past 40 years, it had grown into something much larger, much more valuable than anyone realized. "I was careful," he said, pausing frequently to catch his breath. "Never flashy, never drew attention. But every project led to 3 more. Every client recommended us to their friends. We built half the commercial district downtown, the new hospital wing, that shopping center on Oak Street, the luxury condos by the lake." He'd been strategic about expansion, buying land before development boomed, investing in properties that seemed worthless until the city grew around them. He'd partnered with architects, engineers, and city planners who trusted his vision and his integrity. What had started as a one-man operation building custom homes had evolved into an empire worth tens of millions of dollars. "But I kept living in the same house," he continued, "driving the same truck, wearing the same clothes, because money was never the point. Building things that lasted, that mattered, that was the point." "Why are you telling me this?" His eyes found mine, and in them I saw something I'd never noticed before. Not just love, but respect. The kind of recognition I'd been craving my entire life. "Because you understand what it means to build something that matters. You've been doing it your whole life, Rachel. At the library, in your apartment, in the way you've made yourself into someone I'm proud to call family." The heart monitor beside his bed began beeping more rapidly, and a nurse appeared to check his vitals. She gave me a look that suggested I should let him rest, but Grandpa Edmund wasn't finished. "Your mother thinks money is about status. Richard thinks it's about power. Marcus thinks it's about having whatever you want, whenever you want it." He paused, breathing carefully. "But you understand that real wealth is about building something bigger than yourself. Something that helps people." 3 days later, I was sitting in his room reading aloud from one of his favorite Louis L'Amour novels when he suffered the second heart attack. This one was massive, sudden, final. The machine started screaming, and nurses rushed in, and within minutes, the man who had been the steady foundation of my life for 38 years was gone. I sat beside his bed in the sudden quiet, holding his still warm hand, and realized that I was completely alone in the world for the first time since I was 7 years old. The funeral arrangements were made without my input. I found out about the service the same way I'd learned about his death, from Mrs. Patterson, who had seen the obituary in the newspaper and assumed I already knew the details. "Funny thing," she said, standing in the library's fiction section while I tried to focus on checking in returned books. The obituary made it sound like he only had one daughter. I told my husband, "That can't be right. Edmund talked about his granddaughter Rachel all the time." That's when I realized they had written me out of the story entirely, not just excluded from the planning, not just overlooked in the arrangements, but completely erased from the official record of Edmund Thornfield's life. I drove to my mother's house that evening, something I hadn't done in over 2 years. The Walsh mansion looked exactly the same, all soaring columns and manicured landscaping and windows that gleamed like they were cleaned daily. When Victoria answered the door, she looked genuinely surprised to see me. "Rachel, what are you doing here?" "I came to talk about Grandpa's funeral." She sighed, the kind of exaggerated exhale that suggested I was being unreasonable. "I suppose you want to be involved in the arrangements." "I want to know why I wasn't told he died." "Don't be dramatic. You would have found out eventually." "From the newspaper? From a neighbor? Not from his actual family?" Victoria's expression hardened. "You are not his actual family, Rachel. You're Thomas's daughter. Edmund was kind to you because he felt guilty about Thomas's accident. But you're not a Thornfield anymore. You haven't been for 26 years. The words hit me like physical blows. I stood on the doorstep of the house where I'd lived for a decade, staring at the woman who had given birth to me, and felt something fundamental shift inside my chest. "I see," I said quietly. "The funeral is family only," she continued. "Immediate family. People who actually mattered to him. People who were part of his real life, not just weekend visits and phone calls." Behind her, I could see Richard and Marcus in the living room, going through boxes of what looked like Grandpa's personal effects. They were sorting through his belongings like they were organizing a garage sale, casual and efficient and completely unmoved by the magnitude of what they were handling. "What are you doing with his things?" "Settling his affairs. Someone has to handle the practical matters." "What about the will?" Something flickered across Victoria's face, too quick to identify but significant enough to notice. "What about it? When is it being read?" "That's not your concern." I stood there for another moment, watching my half-brother hold up one of Grandpa's favorite coffee mugs and gesture to Richard with a questioning expression. They were dividing up his life into piles of keep, donate, and throw away, and they were doing it without anyone who had actually loved him. "I'll see you at the funeral," I said finally. Victoria's smile was sharp as broken glass. "No, Rachel, you won't." That night I sat in my apartment above the hardware store, surrounded by the things I'd built with my own hands and my own choices, and felt the last thread connecting me to my family snap completely. They had made it clear that I was unwelcome, unnecessary, and fundamentally unworthy of inclusion in the most basic rituals of grief and remembrance. But as I sat there in the quiet, I remembered something Grandpa Edmund had told me during his final hospital stay. Something about understanding what it meant to build something that mattered. Something about being proud to call me family. And I wondered, for the first time, what exactly he had meant by that. I wondered what arrangements he might have made that nobody had bothered to tell me about. I wondered what my mother and Richard and Marcus might be assuming about Grandpa's will that could be very, very wrong. I drove home to my tiny apartment above Murphy's hardware store in a daze, the envelope from Grandpa Edmund sitting on my passenger seat like a time bomb waiting to explode. The familiar streets of downtown Riverside looked different somehow, as if I was seeing them through new eyes. Many of the buildings I passed, the renovated courthouse, the modern medical center, the shopping plaza where I bought groceries, had been built by Thornfield Construction. Built by my grandfather, built by me now. The thought was overwhelming. Back in my small living room, surrounded by second-hand furniture and books I'd collected over the years, I finally opened Grandpa's letter with trembling fingers. His handwriting was shakier than usual, written during those final months when his health was failing, but his words were as clear and purposeful as ever. "My dearest Rachel," the letter began, "if you're reading this, then you know what I've decided to do and why. But let me explain what it means, and more importantly, what I hope you'll do with it. I spent 43 years building Thornfield Construction, but I wasn't really building a company, I was building a legacy. Every house we constructed was a home for a family. Every commercial building created jobs for people who needed them. Every project improved the community in some small way. The money was never the point, the impact was. I watched your mother choose status over substance when she married Richard. I watched her prioritize appearances over authenticity. I watched her treat you like an inconvenience rather than a gift. And I realized that everything I'd worked for would be destroyed if it fell into the wrong hands. But you, Rachel, you understand what it means to build something meaningful. You've spent your entire adult life helping people, asking nothing in return except the satisfaction of making their lives a little better. You've lived modestly while creating wealth for others through your work at the library. You've stayed true to your values even when it would have been easier to compromise them. The keys in this envelope open a building I bought 5 years ago but never told anyone about. It's at 247 Oak Street, the old Carnegie Library that's been vacant since the city built the new facility. I bought it because I couldn't bear to see it torn down for another strip mall. It's yours now, along with everything else. The blueprints show what I dreamed of doing with that space, converting it into a community center that would serve people the way you've always served people. Free computer classes for seniors, after-school tutoring for kids whose parents work late, meeting space for community groups that can't afford office rent, a place where knowledge and kindness intersect. But those are my dreams, sweetheart. You'll have your own dreams, your own vision for what this inheritance can accomplish. Trust yourself, trust your instincts, build something that matters. And remember, family isn't just about blood, it's about love, loyalty, and showing up when it matters most. You've been more family to me in the past 30 years than anyone else in my life. I'm proud of you, Rachel. I've always been proud of you. Love always, Grandpa Edmund. P.S. There's one more thing in the safe deposit box at First National Bank, box 247. The key is with Morrison. When you're ready, you'll know what to do with what you find there. I set the letter down and picked up the keys, heavy and old-fashioned, the kind that opens substantial locks on substantial doors. The blueprints showed detailed architectural plans for renovating the Carnegie Library, complete with accessibility improvements, modern technology infrastructure, and flexible spaces that could serve multiple community needs. Even in death, Grandpa Edmund was still teaching me, still showing me what it meant to build something bigger than yourself. The next few months passed in a blur of legal paperwork, financial meetings, and gradual understanding of what I'd inherited. The probate process moved slowly but steadily, with Morrison guiding me through each step with the same patient professionalism he'd shown during the will reading. Thornfield Construction was even more successful than I'd initially understood. The company employed over 200 people across 3 states, had projects booked 2 years in advance, and maintained a reputation for quality and integrity that had been built project by project over 4 decades. The management team, led by Grandpa's longtime foreman Michael Torres, had been running day-to-day operations seamlessly since Edmund's death. "Mr. Thornfield always said you'd be taking over someday," Michael told me during our first official meeting. "He talked about you all the time. Said you had the best instincts of anyone he'd ever met, even if you'd never worked construction a day in your life." "I don't know anything about running a company this size," I admitted. Michael smiled, and I could see why Grandpa had trusted him. "He said you'd say that too. He also said that's exactly why you'd be good at it. Said people who think they know everything stop learning, but people who know they don't know everything never stop trying to figure it out." Over the following weeks, I spent my days learning the construction business and my evenings planning the renovation of the old Carnegie Library. The building at 247 Oak Street was everything Grandpa had described, a beautiful, solid structure with good bones that just needed vision and investment to become something extraordinary again. I hired architects, contractors, and community organizers. I met with local nonprofit groups, schools, and social services agencies to understand what was needed most. I spent hours walking through the empty building, imagining it filled with people learning, growing, connecting. The community center opened 18 months later. We called it the Edmund Thornfield Community Learning Center, and it became everything he had envisioned and more. The computer classes for seniors filled up immediately. The after-school tutoring program had a waiting list. Local artists displayed their work in the main hall. Book clubs, support groups, and civic organizations met in the flexible conference rooms. But the space that meant the most to me was the small library I created in what had once been the original children's reading room. It wasn't meant to compete with the city's main library where I'd worked. It was designed to complement it, focusing on community resources, local history, and practical guides for daily life. I staffed it with volunteers, many of them retirees, who wanted to give back to their community. On opening day, I stood in the main hall watching families explore the new space, children racing between activity rooms while their parents signed up for classes and services. Mrs. Patterson was there, beaming with pride as she registered for a watercolor painting workshop. Michael Torres brought his whole family to see what their hard work had helped create. And in a quiet moment, standing alone in the renovated space, I felt Grandpa Edmund's presence as clearly as if he were standing beside me. My family eventually reached out, of course. 3 months after the will reading, Victoria called to suggest we work together to manage the inheritance responsibly. 6 months later, Richard proposed a partnership between Walsh Development and Thornfield Construction that would have given him significant control over my company's operations. Marcus sent a carefully worded letter, explaining how he'd always felt close to his step-grandfather and hoped we could maintain family relationships, despite the, quote, unfortunate misunderstanding about the will. I declined all of their overtures politely but firmly. Some bridges, once burned, can't be rebuilt. Some relationships, once shown to be conditional, can't be trusted again. But I found family in unexpected places. The team at Thornfield Construction became my extended family, united by shared values and common purpose. The volunteers at the community center became my chosen family, connected by a desire to serve others. Mrs. Patterson, now well into her 80s, became the grandmother I'd never really had, dispensing wisdom and homemade cookies in equal measure. 5 years after Grandpa's death, Thornfield Construction was more successful than ever, having expanded into sustainable building practices and affordable housing development. The Edmund Thornfield Community Learning Center had served over 10,000 people and inspired similar projects in 3 neighboring towns. And I had finally opened the safe deposit box at First National Bank. Inside, along with important documents and family photographs I'd never seen, was a small velvet box containing my grandmother Ruth's wedding ring and a note in Grandpa's handwriting, for when you find someone who sees you the way she saw me and the way I've always seen you. I was still looking for that someone, but I wasn't in a hurry. I'd learned that the most important relationship you can have is with yourself, and I'd spent 38 years building that foundation. Everything else could wait. On quiet Sunday mornings, I would sometimes drive past the Walsh Mansion in Riverside Heights. The windows were always perfectly clean, the landscaping always immaculate, the circular driveway always empty of anything but luxury cars. It looked exactly the same as it had when I lived there, beautiful and cold and fundamentally hollow. Then I would drive to the community center and unlock the doors for the day, turning on lights and starting coffee and preparing to welcome whoever might need what we had to offer. And I would think about the difference between a house and a home, between wealth and value, between being seen and being truly known. Grandpa Edmund had been right about everything. Family isn't about blood. It's about love, loyalty, and showing up when it matters most. Success isn't about accumulating money. It's about building something that makes the world a little bit better. And sometimes, the best revenge against people who never believed in you is simply becoming everything they said you could never be, not for their approval but for your own satisfaction. I never did get an apology from my family. I never got acknowledgement of the ways they'd failed me or recognition of what I'd accomplished, despite their neglect. But I got something better. I got to build a life that mattered, surrounded by people who chose to love me not because they had to, but because they wanted to. And in the end, that turned out to be worth far more than $89 million, though having the $89 million definitely didn't hurt. The transformation wasn't immediate, of course. Learning to navigate boardrooms and construction sites while still maintaining my connection to the community took time. There were moments of doubt, sleepless nights wondering if I was making the right decisions, meetings where I felt completely out of my depth, surrounded by men in hard hats who had decades more experience than I did. But Michael Torres and his team never made me feel inadequate. They taught me to read architectural plans, understand building codes, evaluate project timelines and budgets. They showed me the pride that comes from creating something permanent, something that will outlast the people who built it. Your grandfather always said construction is about legacy, Michael told me one afternoon as we toured a new affordable housing development Thornfield was building. Every nail we drive, every beam we place, it's going to be there long after we're gone. People will live in these houses, raise their children here, and build their own legacies. The affordable housing project became my first major initiative as owner of Thornfield Construction. Instead of focusing solely on luxury developments that generated maximum profit, I redirected company resources toward projects that addressed real community needs. We partnered with local nonprofits to build housing for seniors on fixed incomes, working families struggling with rent, and young adults aging out of foster care. The profit margins were smaller, but the satisfaction was immeasurable. Every time I handed keys to a new homeowner, every time I saw children playing in yards that hadn't existed a year before, I understood why Grandpa Edmund had built his company, and why he'd trusted me to carry it forward. The business community took notice, though not always favorably. At Chamber of Commerce meetings and networking events, I encountered the same skepticism I'd faced my entire life, just dressed in more expensive suits. "Rachel's doing admirable charity work," I overheard one real estate developer say at a fundraising dinner, "but she's not maximizing the potential of what Edmund built. A construction company isn't a social service agency." Comments like that reminded me why Grandpa had chosen his heir so carefully. He'd understood that the people who saw construction as merely a way to generate wealth would never appreciate its potential as a tool for community building. The community center continued to evolve beyond my original vision. What started as a simple conversion of the old Carnegie Library grew into a hub for social services, educational programs, and cultural activities that attracted visitors from neighboring counties. We added a commercial kitchen where local entrepreneurs could test restaurant concepts and catering businesses. We created makerspaces where inventors and artists could access tools and equipment they couldn't afford individually. We established a small business incubation program that helped dozens of local companies get their start. But the program I was most proud of was the one that emerged organically from conversations with teenagers who hung around the center after school. They wanted job training, real skills they could use to build careers. Working with Michael Torres and other construction professionals, we developed an apprenticeship program that taught young people trades while they finished high school. "Miss Thornfield changed my life," said David Martinez, one of our first apprentices, during his graduation ceremony 2 years later. "I was headed nowhere fast before I found this place. Now I've got a job, health insurance, and I'm saving money to buy my own house. My mom cries every time she talks about it." Stories like David's reinforced my understanding of what real wealth looked like. It wasn't the number in my bank account, impressive as that had become. It was the ripple effect of investing in people, the way one opportunity could transform not just an individual but their entire family, their whole community. The success of our programs attracted attention from urban planners, social workers, and policymakers studying community development models. Delegations visited from other cities, wanting to replicate what we'd built. I spoke at conferences about sustainable business practices and corporate social responsibility, concepts that would have seemed impossibly sophisticated to the small-town librarian I'd been just a few years earlier. But I never forgot where I came from or the people who had shaped me along the way. Mrs. Patterson remained one of my closest confidants until she passed peacefully in her sleep at age 87. I spoke at her memorial service in the same Methodist church where I'd been excluded from Grandpa Edmund's funeral, this time welcomed not as a reluctant family member, but as a respected community leader. The irony wasn't lost on me. In death, Mrs. Patterson received the kind of celebration that should have been accorded to Edmund Thornfield, a service filled with people whose lives had been touched by her kindness, her generosity, her willingness to see the best in everyone. During those same years, I watched from a distance as my biological family's fortunes shifted. Richard's real estate empire, built on leverage and speculation, struggled during economic downturns that barely affected Thornfield Construction's steady focus on essential community infrastructure. Marcus graduated from college but seemed unable to find direction, cycling through jobs at his stepfather's company without ever demonstrating genuine passion for the work. Victoria aged into the kind of elegant bitterness that comes from having everything money can buy but nothing that truly matters. I encountered her occasionally at charity events, where she would acknowledge me with icy politeness while radiating resentment about the fortune that should have been, in her mind, rightfully hers. At one such event, a fundraiser for the Children's Hospital, she approached me during the silent auction. "You've done well for yourself," she said, her tone suggesting this was somehow surprising. "I've been fortunate," I replied carefully. "Edmund would be proud." It was the closest thing to acknowledgement I'd ever received from her, and I could see the effort it cost her to say it. But I also recognized that it wasn't really about me. It was about her own need to believe that her father-in-law had been mistaken, that his choice hadn't been a fundamental rejection of her values and character. "I hope so," I said simply. We stood there for a moment in awkward silence before she drifted away to rejoin her social circle. I realized I felt nothing. Not anger, not satisfaction, not even sadness. The power she'd once held over my emotions had evaporated completely. That night, driving home through streets lit by construction projects my company had completed, past the community center where evening classes were still in session, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought me to this place. 7 years earlier, I had been an overlooked librarian, living paycheck to paycheck. Now I was a successful businesswoman, worth more money than I could spend in a lifetime. But the real transformation wasn't financial. It was the recognition that I had always been enough, had always been worthy of love and respect, and had always possessed the qualities that mattered most. My family's inability to see those qualities said everything about their limitations and nothing about my worth. As I pulled into the parking garage of the downtown loft I'd purchased, a space that felt like home, in a way the Walsh mansion never had, I thought about the letter from Grandpa Edmund that I still kept in my jewelry box. His words had proven prophetic in ways I was still discovering. I had built something that mattered. I had found my family among people who chose to love me. I had learned that the best revenge against those who underestimate you is not proving them wrong, but proving yourself right. And somewhere in the distance between the girl who had once sat invisible at family dinner tables and the woman who now presided over boardrooms and community meetings, I had discovered the most important truth of all: your worth doesn't depend on other people's recognition of it. Some nights, when the city was quiet and my work was done, I would stand on my balcony looking out over the skyline my grandfather had helped shape, and I would whisper a simple thank you into the darkness. Not just for the money, though that had certainly changed my life, but for the deeper gift he'd given me: the understanding that love isn't something you have to earn through perfection, but something you deserve simply by existing, by trying, by caring about something bigger than yourself. That knowledge, more than any inheritance, had set me truly free. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.